Truth seekers walk a solitary path, one that Schopenhauer understood all too well. What he uncovered in his lifelong pursuit wasn't merely a philosophical system, but a profound revelation about human consciousness that explains why those who dare to see reality as it truly is become strangers among their own kind. The deeper you journey into authentic understanding, the more you'll recognize this painful pattern. The more clearly you perceive truth, the more profoundly you'll be misunderstood by others. This isolation isn't accidental. It's the inevitable consequence of seeing beyond the veil that most people desperately need to maintain. Today I'll reveal why Schopenhauer's insights about willful blindness and painful clarity create an unbridgeable gap between truth seekers and the world, and how this understanding can either strengthen your resolve or crush your spirit entirely. The promise I'm making is straightforward. By the end of this exploration, you'll understand why your pursuit of truth has created distance between you and others. This isn't about validating intellectual superiority. It's about recognizing a psychological pattern that Schopenhauer identified with brutal clarity: the fundamental incompatibility between seeing reality without illusion and maintaining comfortable social bonds. His discovery explains why the deeper you go into authentic understanding, the more alienated you feel from conventional thinking, not because you're wrong, but because you've stepped outside the collective agreements that make social harmony possible. Consider Schopenhauer himself, a man whose biography exemplifies this painful pattern. Born into a prosperous merchant family, he abandoned the comfortable commercial path laid out for him to pursue philosophy. His mother, a popular novelist who hosted intellectual salons, grew increasingly irritated by her son's somber insights and eventually banned him from her home. Their relationship dissolved into bitter estrangement. When his masterwork, The World as Will and Representation, was published in 1818, it was met with near complete indifference. Bookshops returned unsold copies. The academic establishment ignored him. For decades, Schopenhauer lived in relative obscurity, taking his meals alone at the same restaurant each day, conversing with his poodle rather than with people who could not or would not understand his ideas. What Schopenhauer discovered, and what remains largely unacknowledged even today, is what we might call the compatibility principle. This principle explains why truth seekers inevitably become isolated. Human social systems are built not on truth, but on useful fictions. The person who insists on seeing and speaking reality as it is disrupts the delicate web of convenient illusions that make collective life bearable. Schopenhauer observed that most people don't actually want truth. They want comfort, validation, and the security of shared beliefs regardless of their accuracy. The truth seeker's greatest pain comes not from discovering difficult realities, but from the subsequent realization that these discoveries make them fundamentally incompatible with the very social fabric they once belonged to. At the center of this problem lies what Schopenhauer identified as the universal human condition. We are driven by an insatiable will that constantly generates desires which can never be permanently satisfied. Most people cope with this maddening cycle by embracing distractions and illusions. They chase wealth, status, pleasure, anything to temporarily quiet the restless will. But the truth seeker has seen through this game. Once you recognize the will's endless demands for what they are, you can no longer participate in the collective delusion with genuine enthusiasm. You become the sober person at a party of drunks, simultaneously witnessing both their revelry and the emptiness it conceals. The moment of revelation comes when you first experience the profound disconnect between what you now see and what others are willing to acknowledge. Schopenhauer describes this as the veil of Maya being lifted. The illusion that keeps humanity comfortably numb suddenly becomes transparent to you, while remaining opaque to others. This creates not just intellectual disagreement, but a fundamental perceptual divide. You're now seeing a different reality, and no amount of eloquence or evidence can fully translate your vision to someone who remains committed to not seeing it. Look around and you'll observe this pattern everywhere. The colleague who points out the emperor has no clothes is labeled not a team player. The family member who addresses generational trauma becomes the difficult one. The citizen who questions cultural myths becomes unpatriotic. The student who challenges accepted theories is deemed arrogant. These reactions aren't rational responses to the content of truth. their emotional defenses against the disruption of comfortable illusions. Schopenhauer noted that people don't reject truth because they can't understand it. They reject it because accepting it would require dismantling the psychological structures that give their lives meaning and stability. The most disturbing aspect of this dynamic is its inevitability. It isn't a matter of communicating more skillfully or finding the right audience. Schopenhauer recognized that the very act of seeing clearly creates an unbridgeable gap. This isn't elitism. It's a psychological observation about human nature. The person who has awakened to the endless cycle of desire and disappointment that constitutes human existence cannot simply return to blissful unconsciousness, nor can they easily convey this awakening to others who haven't experienced it themselves. The truth seeker doesn't choose isolation. Isolation is the natural consequence of their clarity of vision. Historically, we see this pattern repeat with remarkable consistency. Socrates was sentenced to death for corrupting the youth by questioning accepted beliefs. Galileo faced house arrest for challenging geocentrism. Darwin was viciously attacked for proposing evolution. In each case, the rejection wasn't primarily about the factual claims being made. It was about the threat these claims posed to the comfortable illusions sustaining the social order. Schopenhauer himself wasn't persecuted. He was something perhaps worse, ignored. His insights were too uncomfortable to engage with, so society simply acted as if they didn't exist. The core of Schopenhauer's explanation lies in his understanding of human consciousness as divided between two aspects: the world as will and the world as representation. Most people live entirely in the realm of representation, the filtered, interpreted version of reality shaped by our minds to make existence manageable. But the truth seeker has glimpsed the raw, unfiltered will that underlies all existence, the blind, purposeless striving that generates endless desire. This knowledge fundamentally alters how you experience reality. You no longer see individual desires and sufferings as separate events, but as manifestations of the same universal will expressing itself through countless forms. This perspective is simultaneously liberating and isolating. You understand the human condition more deeply, but that very understanding separates you from those still fully immersed in the world of representation. The primary danger in this situation isn't external rejection, it's the internal crisis that follows. Schopenhauer observed that truth seekers often experience what we might now call existential depression. When you see through the illusions that give most lives meaning, you must confront the question: how do I create meaning while remaining honest about what I've seen? Many truth seekers retreat into cynicism or despair. Others develop an unhealthy contempt for the unawakened masses. Some attempt to force their insights on unwilling listeners, creating mutual frustration. A few even retreat from truth, deliberately re-embracing comforting illusions because the clarity is too painful to bear. Schopenhauer himself found partial relief in aesthetic contemplation and compassion, but even he acknowledged that these were temporary respites from the fundamental condition of conscious existence. A secondary problem emerges when truth seekers try to communicate their insights. Schopenhauer noted that language itself is part of the world of representation. It's a tool designed to navigate conventional reality, not to capture the deeper truths that lie beyond it. When you attempt to describe what you've seen through the veil, you must use words that were created to describe the veil itself. This creates an almost insurmountable communication barrier. Your most profound insights sound like nonsense or pretentiousness to those who haven't experienced the same perceptual shift. Even when you manage to temporarily break through someone's defenses, the mind quickly reasserts its illusions, like water closing around a passing ship. The psychological impact of this communication barrier cannot be overstated. Many truth seekers begin to doubt their own perceptions when faced with constant misunderstanding. Perhaps I'm wrong, they think. Perhaps I'm seeing problems that don't exist. This self-doubt can be healthy when it leads to rigorous testing of your own ideas, but it becomes destructive when it causes you to dismiss genuine insights simply because others can't or won't acknowledge them. Schopenhauer himself experienced periods of doubt and despair, wondering if his life's work had been worthless because so few could grasp what seemed self-evident to him. We see this pattern of misunderstanding repeat with predictable frequency. The truth seeker shares an insight. Others respond with confusion or dismissal. The truth seeker attempts to clarify, often becoming more intense or frustrated. This intensity is interpreted as aggression or arrogance, confirming the other's decision to dismiss the message. The truth seeker withdraws, feeling increasingly alienated. Over time, many truth seekers either stop sharing their thoughts entirely or develop a defensive intellectual arrogance that further distances them from potential understanding. This cycle reinforces both the truth seeker's isolation and others' perception that the truth seeker is problematic rather than insightful. Resistance to uncomfortable truths follows predictable patterns that Schopenhauer identified with remarkable precision. First comes dismissal. That's absurd. Then comes moral judgment. That's a terrible thing to suggest. Next comes misrepresentation. So what you're saying is. Finally comes grudging acknowledgement, mixed with claims of prior knowledge. Well, everyone already knows that. These defensive responses aren't intellectual positions. They're psychological mechanisms designed to protect existing belief structures. The truth seeker who understands this stops taking these reactions personally and recognizes them as almost autonomic responses to cognitive threat. What makes this dynamic particularly painful is that it's a collective phenomenon, not limited to individuals. Entire societies organize themselves around shared illusions, what Yuval Harari might call useful fictions. Money has value because we collectively agree it does. Nations exist because we collectively imagine them. Social hierarchies persist because we collectively validate them. The person who questions these constructs isn't just challenging individual beliefs, they're threatening the invisible agreements that make collective life possible. Society responds to such threats not through reasoned argument, but through mechanisms of marginalization and delegitimization. The truth seeker becomes labeled as cynical, negative, arrogant, or mentally unbalanced, anything to quarantine insights that might destabilize necessary illusions. Schopenhauer observed systematic patterns in how different personality types respond to uncomfortable truths. Some become intensely hostile, attacking both the message and messenger. Others feign understanding while subtly misinterpreting ideas to render them harmless. Some acknowledge truth intellectually while maintaining emotional distance. Yes, that's probably true, they say, before continuing exactly as before. A few respond with genuine recognition. Yes, I've sensed this too, creating brief moments of connection that remind the truth seeker they aren't entirely alone. Schopenhauer found these rare moments of genuine understanding precious precisely because they were so uncommon. According to Schopenhauer's analysis, we can categorize truth avoiders into several distinct types, each with their own defensive strategy. Understanding these types helps truth seekers navigate social environments without becoming unnecessarily alienated or falling into unproductive conflict patterns. The first type is the active denier. This person responds to uncomfortable truths with immediate, often angry rejection. Their defensive mechanism is straightforward: attack anything that threatens their worldview. For them, comfortable illusions aren't just preferences, they're existential necessities. Challenging these illusions feels like a physical threat, triggering fight-or-flight responses. The active denier doesn't engage with evidence or reasoning because their reaction isn't intellectual, it's visceral. Schopenhauer advised minimal engagement with this type, recognizing that their resistance comes from deep psychological needs rather than correctable misunderstandings. The second type is the sophisticated deflector. Unlike the active denier, this person presents as intellectually engaged and open-minded. They'll listen carefully, ask thoughtful questions, and appear genuinely interested in your perspective. However, their engagement is a more subtle form of defense. They excel at shifting conversations away from core uncomfortable truths toward tangential issues, where conventional thinking feels safer. They'll focus on methodological questions rather than findings, theoretical objections rather than practical implications, or isolated exceptions rather than central patterns. The sophisticated deflector never directly rejects truth. They simply ensure the conversation never remains focused on its most challenging aspects. The third type is the truth trivializer. Their strategy is to acknowledge uncomfortable truths, but immediately strip them of significance. Yes, life is meaningless in an ultimate sense, they might say, but that's just obvious and not worth dwelling on. Or, of course, social success is largely about performance rather than authenticity. Everyone knows that. By treating profound insights as trivial observations, they protect themselves from their implications while appearing intellectually honest. The truth trivializer makes the truth seeker feel both understood and dismissed simultaneously, a particularly confusing form of misunderstanding that Schopenhauer found especially frustrating in his interactions with academic philosophers of his time. The fourth type is perhaps the most complex, the intellectual converter. This person doesn't reject uncomfortable truths outright, but translates them into familiar frameworks where they lose their transformative power. When you point out the illusory nature of the self, they respond, "Yes, that's similar to what Pastor Johnson said about humility." When you describe the will's endless striving, they say, "That's just like our quarterly growth targets at work." This conversion process appears respectful, but actually neutralizes insights by absorbing them into existing belief structures. The truth gets acknowledged while its power to disrupt and transform is carefully contained. These defensive patterns create a challenging environment for anyone committed to seeing and speaking truth. But Schopenhauer didn't advocate withdrawal from society or intellectual arrogance toward others. Instead, he suggested a more nuanced approach based on understanding the psychological necessity of illusions for most people. The truth seeker's path involves recognizing that most humans require certain comforting fictions to function, not because they're intellectually inferior, but because consciousness itself is structured to filter and interpret reality in ways that make existence bearable. The integration process for the truth seeker involves several stages, each with its own challenges and potential pitfalls. Initially, many experience what we might call truth euphoria, the exhilarating feeling of seeing through illusions that constrain others. This stage often involves a sense of intellectual superiority and impatience with sleeping people. While temporarily satisfying, this attitude leads to increasing isolation and often backfires when attempting to share insights with others. The next stage typically involves frustration and intensified efforts to make others understand. The truth seeker refines their arguments, accumulates more evidence, and develops more compelling analogies, all in service of bridging the understanding gap. This approach assumes that misunderstanding is primarily a communication problem rather than a psychological necessity. When these efforts inevitably fall short, many truth seekers enter a period of bitter disappointment and cynicism about human nature. The third stage, which Schopenhauer himself embodied for much of his life, involves a retreat into intellectual solitude. The truth seeker stops expecting understanding from others and focuses on developing their own understanding instead. This stage provides intellectual freedom, but often leads to emotional starvation and the unhealthy development of misanthropy. Schopenhauer's caustic comments about humanity and his preference for the company of his poodle reflect the limitations of remaining in this stage. The fourth stage, which Schopenhauer began to approach in his later years, involves the development of compassion based on universal recognition. The truth seeker realizes that all beings are manifestations of the same will, all trapped in the same cycles of desire and suffering. This recognition dissolves the separation between self and other, between the enlightened truth seeker and the deluded masses. Compassion emerges not from moral obligation, but from direct perception of our shared condition. From this perspective, the defensive reactions of truth avoiders aren't personal attacks or intellectual failures, they're understandable responses to threatening insights. The final stage involves what we might call skillful integration. The truth seeker maintains their clear vision, while developing the ability to move between different modes of communication. They don't compromise truth, but they present it in ways that acknowledge where others currently stand. They recognize when someone is genuinely open to potentially disruptive insights, and when someone needs the stability of their existing beliefs. This discernment isn't manipulation, it's compassionate recognition of psychological reality. Throughout this integration process, personal transformation occurs in ways that often surprise the truth seeker. Many begin their journey expecting that clearer understanding will bring greater happiness. Schopenhauer recognized the naivety of this expectation. Truth doesn't necessarily make you happier. Initially, it often makes life more difficult. What truth offers isn't happiness in the conventional sense, but something Schopenhauer considered more valuable: freedom from illusion and the possibility of authentic existence. This transformation typically moves through predictable stages. First comes disillusionment, as cherished beliefs and comforting narratives fall away. Next comes existential crisis, as the truth seeker confronts the implications of living without these psychological supports. Then comes reconstruction, as new sources of meaning emerge based not on comfortable illusions, but on direct engagement with reality as it is. Finally comes integration, as the truth seeker learns to live authentically while still functioning in a world structured around shared fictions. Schopenhauer observed that certain dangers threaten the truth seeker at each stage. In disillusionment, there's the risk of nihilism, rejecting all meaning rather than distinguishing between illusory and authentic sources. In existential crisis, there's the danger of retreat, deliberately re-embracing comfortable fictions because the alternative feels too challenging. In reconstruction, there's the risk of creating new, more sophisticated illusions rather than learning to live with uncertainty and limitation. In integration, there's the danger of developing a secret knowledge mentality that recreates separation in a more subtle form. Let's pause for a moment. As we explore how Schopenhauer uncovered this profound disconnect between truth seekers and their social worlds, I want to ask you something personal. Have you ever felt deeply misunderstood when trying to share an important insight or observation, not just disagreed with, but fundamentally misinterpreted in your intentions and meaning? That moment when you realize the other person isn't simply rejecting your idea, but seems incapable of even seeing what you're pointing to. I know this experience can feel profoundly isolating because we're social creatures who long for genuine understanding. But if you dare, leave me a comment saying, "I recognize that disconnect when," and complete it with your experience. You are not alone in this. Your words might be exactly what another truth seeker needs to read today to feel understood. Sometimes naming our isolation is the first step to finding authentic connection, and Schopenhauer gives us the language to do exactly that. Let's continue now with how this philosopher reveals an unexpected way to navigate this difficult terrain. Schopenhauer warns about specific traps that ensnare many truth seekers. The first is intellectual arrogance, the belief that seeing clearly makes you superior to others rather than simply differently positioned. This trap is particularly seductive because it compensates for the pain of isolation with the pleasure of pride. The second trap is performative truth-telling, using uncomfortable insights to shock or dominate others rather than to serve authentic understanding. The third trap is selective truth, embracing clarity in abstract philosophical matters while maintaining convenient illusions in personal life. The fourth trap is truth weaponization, using insights to wound others when they frustrate or reject you. Schopenhauer fell into several of these traps throughout his life, particularly in his vitriolic attacks on Hegel and other philosophers who received the recognition he felt he deserved. Maintaining authentic truth-seeking requires vigilance against these temptations. Schopenhauer suggested several practices for sustaining clarity without succumbing to its shadow aspects. Regular solitude allows for unfiltered reflection away from social pressures to conform. Aesthetic contemplation, deeply engaging with art, music, and nature, provides temporary release from the will's endless striving. Honest self-observation helps identify where you might be preserving comfortable illusions in your own life. Compassionate engagement with others reminds you that their defensive responses come from the same universal will that operates in you. These practices don't eliminate the fundamental tension between seeing clearly and living socially, but they make it more manageable. Higher integration comes when the truth seeker develops what Schopenhauer called the double standpoint, the ability to simultaneously perceive both the world as will, the underlying reality, and the world as representation, the necessary interface through which humans navigate existence. This integration doesn't mean alternating between two perspectives, but holding them both at once. You recognize social constructs as constructs while still working within them when necessary. You see through personal identity to the universal will behind it, while still responding to individuals as individuals. You acknowledge the ultimate meaninglessness that Schopenhauer identified at existence's core, while still creating meaning through aesthetic appreciation and compassionate action. This double consciousness transforms the initial painful separation between the truth seeker and others into a more nuanced relationship. You no longer expect or need complete understanding from everyone. You develop an intuitive sense for the rare individuals capable of sharing deeper perceptions. With others, you learn to communicate in ways that respect where they are while remaining faithful to what you've seen. This isn't compromising truth. It's recognizing that truth itself includes the reality of different perceptual capacities and psychological needs. In reflecting on Schopenhauer's insights about truth seekers and their inevitable misunderstanding, we discover something paradoxical. The very clarity that initially separates you from others can eventually become the foundation for more authentic connection. When you fully accept the psychological necessity of illusions for most people, not as an intellectual concept, but as a lived reality you observe with compassion, you stop experiencing their defensive reactions as personal rejection. When you recognize that all beings are manifestations of the same striving will, the boundary between the enlightened self and the unenlightened other begins to dissolve. Schopenhauer's final synthesis suggests that the truth seeker's journey isn't about escaping human connection, but transforming it. Initial isolation gives way to discernment about different types and degrees of possible connection. The euphoria of seeing through illusions matures into the quieter satisfaction of living authentically while still participating in the human community. The frustration of being misunderstood evolves into compassion for the universal condition that makes such misunderstanding inevitable. This doesn't mean the path becomes easy. Schopenhauer never suggested that clarity comes without cost. The truth seeker will always experience tensions that others avoid through comfortable illusion. They will always need to navigate between authentic perception and social functioning. They will always encounter resistance when their insights threaten collective fictions. But these challenges are no longer experienced as personal afflictions. They're recognized as inherent features of consciousness itself, navigated with growing skill rather than diminishing frustration. If you've recognized yourself in this exploration of Schopenhauer's insights, if you've felt that painful gap between what you perceive and what others are willing or able to acknowledge, you're not walking this path alone. This channel is a refuge for those who seek to understand the deepest truths of our existence, not to drown in isolation, but to find authentic ways of being both clear-sighted and connected. I invite you to subscribe, not as another number, but as part of a community of seekers who dare to look beyond conventional understandings while learning to navigate a world built around them. Every week we explore these philosophical truths together and how to apply them to find both clarity and connection in a world that often resists both. Leave a comment sharing which aspect of Schopenhauer's understanding of the truth seeker's dilemma resonates most with you. I take time to read each reflection and respond personally. And if you know someone who's also navigating the challenging territory between clear-seeing and human connection, share this video with them. Sometimes the understanding we need most comes through those who recognize our particular form of aloneness. I'll see you in the next video, where we'll explore how, according to Schopenhauer, aesthetic contemplation offers truth seekers a temporary release from both the will's endless striving and the isolation that clarity often brings. Until then, remember, the path of truth isn't about separating yourself from humanity, but about finding more authentic ways to be human.